So in Lenny's opening talk on Monday, he mentioned that the aims of this conference are, 1, to do some cultural analysis, and 2, to represent or translate the church's resources on key issues. And so in this talk, I'm going to attempt to do both of these things on the topic of sex. So you were not warned, that's what I'm talking about in the bulletin, so surprise. You're welcome. Okay. I first gave this talk, I teach at an evangelical school, and I first gave this talk, a version of it, to an evangelical audience. And afterward, when a serious-minded Catholic student came up to me and he said, "Dr. Favale, thank you for your talk, but I would have appreciated fewer jokes and more dogma." So I beefed up the dogma a little, but I have kept the jokes because, both and, right? That's what Catholic's about. So, all right, okay. I'm sorry, I'm probably gonna look there because I forget I have my own cheat sheet down there, but anyway, it doesn't matter. So sex permeates pop culture. It's everywhere: magazine covers, commercials, ads, TV shows, music videos, song lyrics, video games, social media. So I want to sort of distill what sex is in pop culture, but that means having to come up with examples that are, I can discuss in a room full of priests and my mom. So, and maybe some that we've maybe heard of. So I'm choosing 2 examples from pop culture that are kind of long-standing paragons and have been around for at least a decade. So who knows, maybe you will be familiar with them. This is the first example, Grey's Anatomy. And my just FYI, my knowledge of Grey's Anatomy is probably about 4 years old, so for all I know, all these characters are dead. I actually have no idea. But nonetheless, it's fine, it'll prove a point. So in Grey's Anatomy, if you haven't seen it, good for you, first of all. Second of all, it takes place in a fictional hospital in Seattle. I'm from the Northwest, so it's out there full of, it's a hospital full of doctors who are all conventionally attractive and have really larger than life libidos. And they are always in the midst of some sort of crisis or another, relational and medical, usually combined somehow. So what can we learn from Grey's Anatomy? First of all, Seattle is very dangerous. There's always a calamity happening. You should get out of there immediately. Good job, Artur, for making it out alive. He just moved from Seattle. Second of all, hospitals are places where people have sex or die, or both, right? So that's Grey's Anatomy. But what is sex in the world of Grey's Anatomy? So sexual desire is an uncontrollable tsunami that must be dealt with immediately, preferably in an on-call room, even if you've just been removing fecal matter from someone's impacted bowels. It does not matter. If you're in the mood, it has to be done. And it is very difficult to contain this tsunami in a long-term committed relationship because there are always so many beautiful, shiny people that you could be sleeping with around you all the time. And ultimately, your personal happiness and sexual fulfillment is more important than the stability of a long-term relationship. Third, sex is always fun and pleasurable and refreshing and fun and rarely has long-term consequences, except for the disintegration of relationships. In the world of Grey's Anatomy, the excitement of sex and the novelty of new partners help keep the serial in serial monogamy. We also learn that on television, there's lots of sex and few children, but real life tends to be the other way around. All right. So while Grey's Anatomy has the occasional pregnancy, very few compared to the prevalence at which everyone is getting laid. And those pregnancies either result in death, like abortion, miscarriage, or in children that are pretty much raised by someone else because they're rarely on screen. Let's be honest, sex makes for great TV, raising children not so much. My second example, wait a second. Okay, yeah, okay, this is right, this is what I need, okay. All right, so this is my second example, is The Bachelor, okay? And I will confess here that this is my one, well, okay, I have multiple vices, but this is one of them. I do watch The Bachelor. So if you're not familiar with The Bachelor, it's a reality dating TV show where you have a lead who's a single man and like 30 women come on to date him, and he gradually whittles down the pool, and then when he has 3 left, they go on what's called the fantasy suite date, where they get to stay overnight. And then he, after usually presumably sleeping with all three of them, decides which two he liked best and sends one of them home. So here is sort of a gif of a fantasy suite date, right? So there's nothing explicit here. This is about as steamy as it gets. But the producers make sure that we believe that sex has occurred. You know, there's the makeout session on the edge of the bed. I mean, they're not getting revved up to play Scrabble. You kind of know what's going on here. Then there's usually like a shot of the door being shut and these weirdly voyeuristic shots of like the light being turned out in the window. And then in case it's not enough, we transition to like a morning montage where they're in bed, you know, where their camera zooms in on like clothes on the floor, you know, and they're eating like melon balls or whatever in the bed. So, and it all seems like the ending to this romantic comedy. So, the lead usually drops the L word, like, I love you, I love you, I love you, to each of them. And then there's fireworks, gotta have fireworks, night of passion, melon balls. Except for this, there's three of these. There's three consecutive dates in the episode, three separate women, right? And all featuring these same ingredients, wash, rinse, and repeat. So one unlucky woman, it happens to be this one in this season, has the fantasy suite, emphasis on the word fantasy, and then gets sent home. So congratulations, right? Haha, yeah, he gets two left now, okay. So the logic here, I know, it's really, the logic here is that the fantasy suite is the place to test your connection with the remaining women. You take the car for a test drive, sleep with three women who have professed love to you, choose the two you like best, and then think about maybe committing to one of them, but probably just for a few months before you break up, because now you're on Dancing with the Stars and there's a bunch of hot women who are into you. So I put my slides slightly out of order. So this first paradigm I'm going to call the consumerist paradigm. All right. This is the paradigm that dominates popular culture. All right, so now, okay. In this paradigm, reality revolves around the autonomous, desiring self. I want, therefore I am. And you see this in the rhetoric of The Bachelor. The contestants all speak the same sort of lingo where they talk about my feelings, my connection. I can see my future with this person. This person will complete me, right? So the focus is all on the desiring self. What is sex for in this paradigm? Recreation. Or it can be for procreation if you want it to, at which point you can sort of flip the switch. But primarily, sex is about the fulfillment of one's individual desires, because in this paradigm, all of reality is about facilitating the freedom of the individual to pursue his or her desires. This freedom is unlimited, theoretically, as long as it doesn't impinge on another person's autonomy, right? So that's the limit of the freedom of the autonomous self, is another person's autonomy. Within this paradigm, a certain view of the human person tends to emerge. An instrumental view of the human person. So what do I mean by instrumental? Using another person as a tool, an instrument, a means to an end, namely a means to the end of the fulfillment of my desires. This person is the means by which my desires, whether for orgasm or intimacy or a child, are fulfilled. But because sex is always sex with, it is an act that inherently involves another person, even if it's just a fantasized person or the image of a person. A recreational view of sex turns that person into an instrument for recreation, something that can facilitate my pleasure or fun. Pope Francis has spoken about our throwaway culture, and I think that's a great way to think about this sexual paradigm. The consumerist paradigm is a throwaway culture when it comes to sex. In addition to an instrumental view of the other, this mentality also creates an instrumental and mechanistic view of one's own body. If autonomy is the central value in this paradigm, the human body with its limitations becomes an obstacle to be overcome. It's a limit on my freedom in pursuit, so overcoming the body to pursue one's individualistic freedom. And then one's own body can become a sex object, sometimes quite literally through plastic surgery. There's a procedure called labiaplasty, which is kind of shaving off excess labia to make it look more like pornified, that has skyrocketed since the early 2000s. So very literally, the sort of objectification of one's own body to fulfill this kind of sexual fantasy. Another way one can sort of objectify the body is just sort of see it as an orgasm machine, this thing that should be manipulated to give as many hits as possible. Because bodily fertility is a threat to autonomy, especially for women, the natural connection between sex and procreation needs to be severed, right? So this is an image, and I don't even know, you can ignore the words on the bottom, but I just found this image in a bunch of stock images when I was preparing this presentation, and I thought, oh, this is perfect. Because this image illustrates how our cultural imagination views the relationship between sex and procreation. It's a bizarre inversion, right? Oops, the sperm made it to the egg. Like it should say mission accomplished, right? I mean, that's what the sperm want to do. They want to get there. This isn't an oops. This is a success story. So when it comes to sexual morality in this paradigm, is there any guiding sense of right and wrong? Yes. There is something that separates right sex from wrong sex, and that is consent. Is my autonomy being violated? And pleasure. Does this feel good to everyone involved? Now let me be clear, consent is crucial. Emphasizing the importance of consent is something good that this paradigm has to offer. But consent should be the beginning, not the end of a discussion about sexual morality. It is not enough to simply say that the best we can expect from sex, morally speaking, is that it's not rape. The Me Too movement, arguably, is showing the fault lines in this consumerist paradigm. The poverty of a sexual morality that is based purely in consent, because it's clear that someone can be misused, abused, harmed by sex that is technically consensual. So what are the implications of this consumerist paradigm? I would argue that it's been disastrous for our culture. So here's an example that is not fantasized. This is a real life example. So this is a Facebook post from someone whom I don't personally know, but it was public, and so it came up on my feed because we must be connected. But I've hid her identity, even though it was a public post, just to preserve her anonymity. So she writes, I've been waffling back and forth wondering whether to post this because it's an intensely personal and multitudinously painful thing I'm going through. It's important to me, though, to put myself out there as an illustration of why it's so important to have safe, ready access to abortion services. This is the second time in my life I've been on long-term, regular hormonal birth control and gotten pregnant anyway. Practicing safe and protected sex is not foolproof. Being with a loving long-term partner does not have me jumping at the bit to be a mother, and bringing a pregnancy to term is simply not an option for me physically, emotionally, or financially. I sincerely feel that a woman has a right to choose in any scenario, birth control or not, monogamous partner or not, financially stable or not. Bodily autonomy exists, and it exists for a reason. When I saw this, immediately the irony jumped out at me in that last sentence. Bodily autonomy exists, and it exists for a reason. The very reason she's in this tragic predicament is because bodily autonomy when it comes to sex does not exist for women as it does for men. It must be violently enforced on the female body. The burden of the fantasy in the consumerist paradigm falls heavily on women and children. A man can have sex until his eyeballs pop out. He's not going to get pregnant. This is not true for women. My husband actually was conceived after a tubal ligation, for example. So the existence of my entire family is a testament to the fact that birth control doesn't necessarily sever the connection between sex and procreation. There's ample room here for a feminist critique. This myth of complete sexual freedom, of bodily autonomy, is based on the male experience. We're all being sold a myth about what sex is, but it is women who pay the steepest price when this fantasy crashes into reality, as happened to this woman. Here's a quote I want to share in its entirety. It's from agrarian philosopher Wendell Berry, whose work is really great in this area. He's Christian, not Catholic, but he's still primo. He writes about the costs of this paradigm. What are these costs? In fact, our sexual revolution is mostly an industrial phenomenon in which the body is used as an idea of pleasure or a pleasure machine with the aim of freeing natural pleasure from natural consequence. Like any other industrial enterprise, industrial sexuality seeks to conquer nature by exploiting it and ignoring the consequences by denying any connection between nature and spirit or body and soul, and by evading social responsibility. The spiritual, physical, and economic costs of this freedom are immense. So what are these costs? This consumerist approach to sex, to people, we can look at hookup culture, sex trafficking, sexual assaults on college campuses, STD epidemics. We can look at consumerist attitudes toward reproduction like surrogacy outsourcing. If you want to talk about the commodification of women's bodies, look there. Catholic feminists should be writing and speaking about that issue, absolutely. And pornography, we've been talking about pornography today as well, and I wanted to just say a little bit about that too. And I really appreciated how the previous speaker talked about how this is not just a man's issue, right? Women struggle with this too. I have female students talk to me all the time about their own porn use. And this is a burden we all carry. Simply because we exist in this cultural historical moment, it's not something we asked for, not something we chose. I first saw porn when I was 12, and this was before the days of the internet. Because pornography ostensibly meets the criteria for moral neutrality in the consumerist paradigm, consent and pleasure, I say ostensibly because you can never know when you're watching porn whether or not what you're watching is consensual. Okay, so that's why I say ostensibly, because I think that's a problem. But ostensibly it meets the consent and pleasure. So it's become mainstream. And porn shapes all pop cultural representations of sex. In pornography, we see the distillation of the consumerist attitude toward sex. Human beings are reduced to images for voyeuristic consumption, and often images that degrade and depersonalize both men and women for the use of the individual to give him or herself fleeting pleasure. What's really dangerous about pornography, though, is that it trains us to think about sex in a specific way. In terms of ourselves, our pleasure, and other bodies, not as human beings who carry the divine image, but as instruments to facilitate pleasure. So, bottom line, the consumerist paradigm has created an unjust, solipsistic culture that revolves around the fulfillment of adult desires, particularly male adult desires. So what has been the prominent Christian alternative in our culture? I'm going to call this the purity paradigm. I grew up as an evangelical in the evangelical subculture, and the purity paradigm was presented as the prevailing Christian alternative to the consumerist paradigm. Think of like the True Love Waits campaigns in the 90s. They started purity rings, purity balls. If you don't know what purity balls are, you should Google it because it's cool. It's trippy. The debates over abstinence, it's not what you think either. They're like dances, okay, purity balls. The debates... Okay. So the debates over sex education in schools, abstinence-only sex education, so these cultural clashes are often between the consumerist paradigm and the purity paradigm. And this is just a sidebar, but I'm interested because I did not grow up in the Catholic Church and I do not currently teach in a Catholic setting how prevalent this paradigm is in Catholic youth culture. So if you have thoughts on that, you should email me or come talk to me afterwards because I'm curious about that. So the purity paradigm in a nutshell is wait until you are married to have sex, and the presumption is that you will get married because everyone gets married and people who don't are sad. Wait until marriage to have sex, and if you don't, you will lose your purity. So first of all, before I critique this, what is good here? Okay, so at least we're thinking about sex beyond the self, beyond just the pursuit of one's individual desires. There is a sense that we exist within and are accountable to a moral order that is higher than our own whims and urges. There's a sense that sex has a context in lifelong marital union. So the purity paradigm upholds the expectation that sex belongs within marriage. Unfortunately, it preserves the rule without any theology behind it. So what is sex for, according to the purity paradigm? That's not a question that's asked. I don't know. Conversation revolves around when to have sex, not the underlying principle of what sex is for or why you would wait until marriage, beyond just usually a biblical kind of prescription, at least in the evangelical version. The question that dominates when it comes to my students is how far is too far, right? They're like, where can I draw the line, okay, and be okay? Like, how far is too far? No one's talking about what sex is for. It's how far is too far. So the focus is on the rule rather than the reasons for the rule. So the problems with the purity paradigm, it tends to motivate through shame and fear rather than reason, love, and beauty. It can create legalistic attitudes about sex. So here's an extreme anecdote. When I was a student at an evangelical college, I knew a couple who had anal sex to avoid losing their purity, right? So that is an illustration there of missing the spirit of the letter, missing the spirit over the letter. So trying to, focusing on the rule, but not at all kind of the reasons behind it. So this kind of legalistic attitude, like, oh, as long as I don't do X, then I'm fine. I think it tends to lead to double standards for men and women and feeds into the sexualization of women. The sexual objectification of women in pop culture is a huge problem. That's sort of an understatement. But the purity paradigm is really anxious, particularly about women's virginity, not so much about men's, although that's important too. And so then we get this kind of damaged goods narrative, which is really antithetical to a gospel of grace and continual conversion. It's basically that once you've lost your purity, it's gone. You can't do anything to get it back. So in that sense, the purity paradigm offers a fundamentally reductive vision of purity that can really blind us toward non-sexual sins and lead us to define our moral or spiritual worth according to our sexual history. The purity paradigm also ignores the very important question of how to faithfully live out one's sexuality after you get married. Guess what? It's still possible to use and objectify your spouse and yourself, your own body, even if you're married. In the purity paradigm, there's a pretty simplistic narrative about, like, sex is bad, it's scary, don't do it. But then when you're married, it's awesome, it's amazing. Like, every night is like the fantasy suite, and you'll have sex every day, and yeah, it's not true. Okay. And you might hear notes of the kind of consumerist pleasure paradigm creeping in, even to what I'm saying. And that's one of the problems with the purity paradigm. It too easily leads to a consumerist view of sex just within marriage. It just kind of shifts it, like you just sort of hold off and then you get married and you can sort of do whatever. And it's still very much focused. Both the purity and the consumer paradigm are very much kind of pleasure-only paradigms. If there's a teleology to sex, it's teleology of the orgasm. That's what sex is about. So there's a focus here on not on lifelong chastity, but on physical virginity, right? So I want to expand this concept just a little bit. So in the purity paradigm, purity is shorthand for whether or not one has had sex. So the default state is purity, and one is in danger of losing this state permanently. So the implied movement is from purity to sin, and then you're just kind of marooned there. This is entirely opposite from the trajectory of the Christian life, in which the movement is from human sinfulness we all have, and toward the purity of conversion, Christ-likeness. So if purity is synonymous with virginity, it's something either you have or you don't. It can be lost and never regained. And this is at odds with a holistic Christian notion of purity as a lifelong process of being conformed to Christ. So I'd love for us to reclaim the word purity and give it new, better meaning. The purity paradigm gives us a rule to follow, but not an overarching vision of ourselves in the context of the divinely created order. So what might that look like? What's the alternative here? And this is the Catholic paradigm. The third paradigm I'm going to talk about, which is the two sort of principles or the marks of it are teleology and incarnation, which I believe are uniquely preserved in the Catholic Christian tradition. I mean, let me tell you guys, like I'm a former evangelical, I still work in an evangelical context, and you all are sitting on a gold mine when it comes to talking about sex. You have such resources here in Catholic theology and tradition that are just waiting to be shared with the rest of the world. So Christian tradition gives us guidelines about sex. It's true, but far more importantly, we are given a worldview. So what is the purpose, the meaning of sex within this worldview? I'm going to highlight two concepts that will help us deliver a richer theology of sexuality, teleology and incarnation. First, what does it look like to think about sex teleologically? So teleology is the doctrine of design and purpose in the material world. So the title of this lecture, What is Sex For?, is a teleological question. It assumes that sex is for something. There's a purpose or end to which it's designed. There's an ultimate purpose for sex. So when I'm talking about the telos of sex as a Christian, I'm working from the perspective that the physical world, including our bodies, especially our bodies, is divinely created and thus endowed with God-given purpose. And because we are also endowed with reason, we can look closely at the created order and discern its divine design. The body then speaks of its purpose. It speaks of its telos through its form and function. So what would it look like to read the body in this sense, to discern its telos? The telos of sex. Let's think biologically for a minute. There are many kinds of genital acts and intimate acts, but sex is unique. Sex involves one flesh union. That's not merely a nice metaphor from Genesis, because the act of sex creates a bodily union between two living beings whose bodies are uniquely designed to form a complete reproductive entity. Let's make an analogy with another bodily system. All of our bodily systems are complete except for the reproductive system. So sex is that act of bringing together two incomplete and complementary systems to create one reproductive organism. What if our respiratory system functioned this way, or our digestive system? Let's talk about the respiratory one. The other one could get a little weird. Okay, what if we had, say, like one person had the lungs, the other person has the diaphragm, and in order to breathe, we have to sort of like, kind of like come together, take a breath, you know? So yeah, it could get complicated, but that's sort of an analogy here for what sex is. So we would, if we had that kind of respiratory system, we would readily see that the bodily act of bringing those incomplete systems together served a specific biological function. But in our cultural imagination, when it comes to sex, we've lost sight of the obvious. Like that oops slide, that's how we think about it. Like procreation is sort of like an STD, you know, pregnancy and STD, like, oh, gotta avoid those things. We could also make an analogy with eating. I think we're more able to recognize a disordered use of a bodily system when we call bulimia, for example, an eating disorder. If someone were to eat for the pleasure of taste, but then vomit the food, denying nutrition to the body, we recognize that as a misuse of the body, something that undermines the well-being of the person. But we've lost that sensibility when it comes to sex, even though using our bodies and the bodies of others for temporary pleasure also undermines our human flourishing. In the act of sexual intercourse, the body speaks the language of one flesh union. So John Paul II, in his work, The Theology of the Body, talks about this, how the language of the body speaks. And in sex, the body is saying, I am one with you. I give myself to you, my whole self, even my capacity to create life with you. When sex is taken out of the context of lifelong union, this language that the body speaks through sex becomes a lie. Instead of, I give myself fully to you, it's, here's a little bit of me just for now. Remember that fantasy suite date? She said, I love you. Through sex, their bodies spoke, I belong to you, and the next morning he dumped her. From the consumerist perspective, this is fine. It makes total sense. Of course, the bachelor needs to try out each woman before making his final decision. He needs to test sexual compatibility because he needs a partner whose desires are tailor-made to his, which, by the way, does not exist. Try before you buy. But if we're thinking more theologically and teleologically from the scope of a Christian worldview, this attitude towards sex is an extreme distortion. Now, pleasure, sure, of course, it's a feature of sex, but the pleasure is purposeful. It is oriented towards certain ends, certain goals. I mean, we don't have a clitoris on the palms of our hands, right? Like, it's pretty obvious when you really think about it, okay? Is that too much? Sorry. So the pleasure of sex does not exist for its own sake. So what is its purpose then, right? We have this beautiful language in the Catholic tradition of a twofold telos, union and procreation. The and there is really important. The modern consumerist temptation is to pick and choose from a menu. I want a union, but no kids. I want kids, but not a union. I just want an orgasm without kids or a union. Right? But if we read the design of the body and see that sex has both unitive and procreative power, and if we believe that God is not an arbitrary craftsman, that means that those two powers are meant to be interconnected. And the Catholic tradition alone has preserved the full telos of sex as twofold, creating an enduring union that is open to life. So the one flesh union of a couple is not inward facing. It's not merely concerned with the happiness of the two people involved. The unitive power of sex is connected to its fruitful power, a synergetic power, the creation of another human life, which means that a couple is bonded not only for their own good, but for the good of another. So to think about sex theologically and teleologically necessitates that we actively cultivate an awareness of its procreative potential. Rather than blindly absorbing the pop cultural attitude that sex is about recreation rather than procreation, we should adopt an attitude of being open to life as a guiding principle. By openness to life, I mean a conscious acknowledgement and embrace of the divinely created reality of our sexed bodies, an active awareness that having sex could result in the creation of another human being, and it is thus a matter of justice. Justice to the Creator and justice toward the human person who could be brought into being, to decide to live harmoniously with the created order and refrain from sex unless it can occur in the context of a lifelong marital bond. So we need to think about sex in terms of love and responsibility, right? Like Carol Wojtyła, that's his book, read it. Love of God and neighbor, and an awareness of our fertile embodiment, which endows us with a sacred responsibility. Sex is how we participate in the transmission of human existence. That is why Christian tradition for 2 millennia has located marriage as the proper context for sex. It's not an arbitrary rule. At a fundamental level, this rule springs from an awareness of the objective reality of the created order and our place in that order, and from an underlying ethic of justice and love. Love of God and his design, justice toward other human beings, especially those who are most helpless and vulnerable. So what about the Incarnation? What does it mean to think about sex in the context of the Incarnation? The Word became flesh. This is an event, the turning point, the fulcrum of all human history. And if it's true, it changes everything. If this is true, if the Incarnation is true, then everything that exists, the natural world, all of human history, has meaning only because of this, and exists only to anticipate and then celebrate this event, to prepare humankind for the descent of God into human existence. This means that God created body beings, so that one day he could become a body. Notice I didn't say inhabit a body, as if the body is just a fleshly shell encasing the immaterial person. He became a body. He created a visible, sensible world, a world of bodies, as a visible reality that could make the invisible tangible. All of reality is sacramental in this way. All of reality exists to make God known to us. What does this have to do with sex? Everything. The fact that we are sexuate beings, that human beings are characterized by sexual complementarity, that our continued existence as a species depends upon that reality, that is part of God's self-revelation to us. Let me repeat, sex is part of God's self-revelation. Conjugal union is the primary metaphor that we've been given to understand the relationship between Christ and us, Christ and the church. And the implications of this are profound. This means that God designed human beings for sexual communion and self-giving love as a way to more deeply understand and embody our relationship with him. So how we think about sex is deeply important. A crucial aspect of God's self-revelation comes through the design of our bodies. Like God, we have the power to create new life, but we can't do it alone. As individuals, we have to be united with another person through a total gift of self, and from that mutual self-giving springs the possibility of new life. If we have a self-centered, mechanistic, pleasure-seeking view of sex, we distort this metaphor and lose its profound meaning. How we think about sex and how we think about the dignity of all human beings is connected. How we think about sex and how we think about God is connected. I recently came across a book by Josh Whedon and Robert Kurzban called The Hidden Agenda of the Political Mind. Oh, right, I already said that. Okay. how we think, okay, well, where am I? Okay. I recently came across a book by Josh Whedon and Robert Kurzban called The Hidden Agenda of the Political Mind. It's on self-interest and how that shapes our opinions, but they have a really interesting chapter on religion and sexuality. And this is coming totally from a value-neutral sort of secular perspective. They're not necessarily, I don't think they're Christians or coming from that framework at all. But in this chapter, they distinguish between what they call ring bearers and freewheelers. So the demographic markers for these two groups of people. The ring bearers tend to have fewer sexual partners. They use drugs and drink less. They tend to get married more. They have fewer divorces or cohabitating relationships and more children. Those are the ring bearers. The freewheelers have more sexual partners, use drugs and drink more heavily, have more same-sex partners. They get married less frequently, have more divorce and cohabitation, and fewer children. So there are these two groups of people. And their analysis reveals something startling, that sexual lifestyle choice shapes religious engagement, not the other way around. So in their analysis, they sort of argue that as young people come into adulthood and begin making choices about how to live out their sexuality, it's those choices that determine whether or not they stay engaged in the church or not. It's not their church involvement that determines their sexual behavior. So they write, what distinguishes those who go to church a lot from those who don't? The big distinguishing feature, it turns out, involves sexual and reproductive lifestyles. People go to church more often when they have ring-bearer lifestyles, and more often eschew organized religion when they have freewheeler lifestyles. In short, as young people start making their own decisions about their lives, they tend to match their religious participation to their lifestyles. So I was really struck by this because it really bears out, again, coming from a non-Christian perspective, they're not even really thinking about this. They're just thinking about it in a value-neutral way. But that how we think about sex influences how we think about God, and what we do, our sexual praxis, shapes our religious praxis. I wrote this lecture about sex in a community of over 100 celibate men, Mount Angel Abbey, if anyone's ever been here. It's like the most wonderful place. I love it, yes. So it's near where I live, Mount Angel Abbey. So Catholicism has a rich tradition and history. It's people with saints and heroic individuals who have offered up their sexuality as a gift to God. In the pop culture paradigm, people like that, like the men who live on this hill, don't exist. Or if they do, they're oppressed, sad freaks. And that's a powerful lie. While I was working on the lecture, I took coffee breaks to talk with my friend Stephen, who's a seminarian at Mount Angel. He and I live very different lifestyles. He's committed to lifelong celibacy, I'm married, but we're both trying to figure out how to live our sexuality and faithfulness under the Christian canopy. There are different models for the Christian life, different ways of living a holy life, and both come with suffering and renunciation and sacrifice, as well as deep joy and different kinds of freedom. The consumerist paradigm will tell you that suffering and sacrifice must be avoided at all costs, whereas the Catholic paradigm proclaims the redemptive power of self-sacrifice. Something Stephen said to me has stuck with me. We've been tricked into thinking that what is meaningful about sex is only the act itself, rather than its fruits. But it is the fruits of sex that are most meaningful, the fruits being a lifelong friendship between a man and a woman, and the gift of new life. In discussions about marriage, too often there's a disproportionate attention paid to the sex act itself. And in discussions of celibacy, too often there's disproportionate attention to the lack of the sex act. How can you live without sex? The focus instead should be on the unique fruits and freedoms offered by each state of life. God loves everyone universally and also has a particular love for each one of us individually. The celibate vocation and the married vocation each reflect a dimension of God's love. The celibate or single person is freer to love more broadly, to embody God's universal, non-particular love in a way that a married person cannot and really should not. Each state of life comes with its particular fruits, its particular freedoms, and sacrifices. Christianity is not about the elimination of sexual desire, but the orientation of it for the sake of love. Sex is meant to lead us somewhere, into Christ-like, self-giving love. Distorted, consumerist ideas of sex simply lead us back toward ourselves, towards slavery rather than freedom. In a truly Christ-centered paradigm, everyone is called to carry a cross when it comes to sex. We are called to reorient our sexual desires for the sake of love. If we think about sex and marriage as existing to fulfill our needs, then we've missed the whole point. If we think the celibate or single life is all about self-sacrifice, but married life is not, we've missed the point. We're just living in that bachelor fantasy. Here's a quote from David Foster Wallace. He was an American writer. He has a great commencement speech. So it's two young people called "This Is Water." If you have never listened to it, you should YouTube listen to it. In that speech, he says, "The really important kind of freedom involves attention, awareness, and discipline and effort, and being able to truly care about other people and to sacrifice for them over and over in myriad, petty, little unsexy ways every day. That is real freedom." So I want to end here with an exhortation, I guess. In every historical moment, the church must respond to the heresies of its day with a contra mundum spirit. This consumerist paradigm is perhaps the reigning heresy of our time, and it's our duty to respond boldly to it. Catholic tradition, more than any other, uniquely preserves this third paradigm. Protestantism, which has conceded to the wider culture on issues like contraception and divorce, is left to draw an arbitrary line at same-sex relationships if it attempts to draw that line at all. But the Catholic vision of the cosmos is coherent, consistent, and compelling. And Catholicism also has a thriving tradition of celibacy, a model of the good life that goes beyond sex and marriage, that prefigures the life to come. While it might be tempting to be discouraged at the widening chasm between the church and this culture of autonomy on the issue of sex, there's another way of looking at it. The time is ripe for proclaiming the beauty and logic of Catholic teaching on sexuality. Our young people are hungry for this kind of thing. Our young people are hungry for meaning and purpose. Our young people are ready for a call to heroic virtue, not just another person to high-five all their choices. Our young people value freedom, love, and human dignity. We need to articulate how the Catholic paradigm alone uniquely preserves those very things by giving us an understanding of love that is oriented toward others, and an understanding of the self that is relational rather than autonomous, an understanding of the human body as beautiful, good, and integral to our personhood, and an understanding of freedom as living into rather than defying our givenness as embodied beings within an ordered cosmos. Freedom, in fact, is living toward our telos, ordering our loves in harmony with this givenness.
Outside of a formation or an education into sort of Catholic teaching, how do we form people in this? And if we follow some of the principles we've laid out today, it has something to do with the nature of practice. And I want to claim that something about the liturgical life of the church actually forms us for proper orientation towards sex. Now, of course, this is going to sound strange and perhaps not surprising since I direct a Center for Liturgy. And if you've ever met people who care about the liturgy, they offer it as a medicine for everything. So the only thing you need is liturgy, right? So that will solve racism, homelessness, everything is solvable through liturgy. So I sort of want to make this point and prove it to you in about 15 or 20 minutes. And I want to make the point through an event this summer. I was in Belgium when I got a phone call that my grandmother had the final stroke that was going to lead to her death. She had had Alzheimer's for 9 years, 10 years, and this stroke was the one. And of course, there's a powerlessness when you find that someone whom you love so much is so far away, and you're far away. So I did what any good Irish Catholic would: escape from everyone else. There are people in the world who like to be around other people in their sorrow. I like to get on trains and not see anyone. So what better thing to do than to just go see part of the Belgian countryside away from the conference? So I left and I went to Ghent. because there was the great altarpiece that I had wanted to see, the sort of altarpiece that you see here, the mystic supper of the Lamb. And I'd always wanted to see it. So, I go into Ghent all by myself, get off a train all by myself, walk to the church all by myself, wander the church, unable to speak Flemish with any degree of precision. No, that's incorrect. Unable to speak Flemish, not even to understand what it was. And I walk into the chapel, and I had arrived at they actually, it was one of the few churches I visited in Belgium that you could tell people actually prayed in, which is a dark world, but there were candles, people were kneeling. It wasn't just a sort of tourist attraction. And I went in to this side chapel, and the altarpiece had been closed. They were just about to open it. I arrived at the perfect time. And there are a bunch of tourists there for whom had no idea. There were like people who they just knew that this wasn't the important thing you see when you're in Ghent, so you go there. So they walked in. Everyone's like, what is this? What's going on? This just looks like pictures of random people because it wasn't opened. And then the curators came out, the museum people. But they did something remarkable. They walked to the altarpiece, and they bowed. And suddenly the attention of everyone gathered was transformed. That space, which had been previously a kind of tourist zone, was transformed into something else. Space had been sanctified. And they opened the altar, and there to behold was this image, the Lamb once slain. Of course, this was particularly affective for me at the time because as I thought about my grandmother joining this banquet of the Lamb. This capacity for liturgy to transform us, to bring us out of ourselves into communion with others, into communion with other people whom I did not want to be in communion with. It was Europe. There wasn't a lot of deodorant. I did not want to be in deep communion with anyone. Made me go out of myself. What Gabriel Marcel says about the vocation of the human person, that his motto is not sum, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, but sursum cor, lift up your heart. Liturgy has this capacity, and how? Well, we've said something about this, that there's something about the way, this is Augustine, a sort of Augustinian point that has really been present throughout, that one becomes what you love. You become what you love. You become what you love. And if you love the wrong thing, and if you love in the way that Abigail was talking about, you'll become that kind of lover. If you love your smartphone, you'll find yourself into a space where you become the kind of person who adores the screen, who can't actually meet presence. We become what we love. And Pope Benedict knew this. As he said, the worship of God in our lives cannot be relegated to something private and individual, but tends by its nature to permeate every aspect of our existence. Worship pleasing to God becomes a new way of living our whole life, each particular moment of which is lifted up, since it is lived as part of a relationship with Christ and as an offering to God. It is through the act of worship that our whole bodies are transformed into an offering of God. Our sexual identity, our greatest desires, our hopes and our dreams are offered to the living God as a Eucharistic offering. So today, what I'd like to do is just very briefly the following is, how is it that something like our sexuality, which can become an offering of our total freedom, by the way, I sometimes think people say this. I'd like to say this, especially with the bishops here, if you don't mind. there are a lot of people who are properly will say something like the church focuses too much on sex. If they mean like too often we're telling people what to do with their bodies, if that's what you mean. But that's a terrible understanding of sexual ethics. You know, like, my body is a big part of my existence. What I do with it matters. And sometimes when we hear those words as lay people, we think to ourselves, we're kind of left alone now to deal with this. Like, we actually need a sort of coherent response about what we do with our bodies. Of course, that involves taking care of the poor, but it also involves, for a good chunk of us lay people, sex. And the freedom that we offer unto God through that, whether it's through relationships, whether it's through celibacy, whether it's through giving our sexuality through marriage, whether it's somewhere in between that as we sort of develop sexual identities. But I wanted to think about how the liturgy actually forms us to give our bodies away well in marriage. And I want to use Dietrich von Hildebrand. So how does liturgy form us towards sex and marriage? I love my wife. I had the strangest dream last night. I promise it will be like none of the things that Abigail just talked about. So, I dreamt, it's hard being married now close to 13 years to think about when, I actually been married for 13 years, I should really get that correct. So being married for 13 years, it's hard to sometimes remember what it was like when you first met your spouse, like when you first met. And I dreamt that I was living in a house with 10 other people, and I met my spouse for the first time in this house. There was a series of weird, conditions that we were living in this house. There was only one washer and dryer, and we were all gathered around the washer and dryer. On Sundays, we wore NFL jerseys, and we were all wearing NFL jerseys. But amidst whatever my subconscious was trying to work out, I saw in my spouse, I last night remembered the feeling I had when I first met my wife. The utter joy that occurred when I saw her, the fact that I knew I was going to marry her on our first date but couldn't say it, because that's extreme. I remembered it. And love is so connected to the gift of ourself as people. This moment of love which transcended through time into my subconscious, into my weird house, imagined house. This giving of myself, in loving Kara, I was opened and am open to a world of values, as Dietrich von Hildebrand, the philosopher, says, that are not just about affection, but my affection is involved. The decisive mark of the value response is its character of self-abandonment. In enthusiasm, veneration, love, or adoration, we break open our self-centeredness and conform to the importance in itself. The value response is a conforming of ourselves to the logos, that is the reason or rationality of the value. In meeting my wife, I had all the signs that you were in love. I liked her. My hand tingled when I touched her hand. The way that Catholics often try dating is through standing next to each other while praying the Our Father. Our Father, yeah. Okay, so of course this is deeply ironic because I hate holding hands during the Our Father now. I'm a very good, I lived in Boston for 8 years and I loved it. No one touched me for years, so. But I was opened up to a world of values through this encounter with my spouse. The value of goodness. The value of sacrifice. I'll always remember that early in our relationship, I was ill. and she brought me over, she came over to care for me in a stomach bug. And of course I'm like an incapacitated male, and if you have men who are sick, they are so incapacitated. So I was dying, and she sat with me despite the misery that she was going to get this thing. She was going to get this terrible illness that was infecting my body, yet she sat with me and fed me ice cubes over an hour, giving me one every 10 minutes in order to rehydrate. The value of goodness, the value of self-sacrifice, the value of love. Of course, these values are present beyond eros, but we're talking about sex. This is friendship, that we share a world of values together, a world where we can commune around gifts, things like a common mission, a common purpose. These are the values that are present in our love of our children. As we look at our children and we see the possibility of new life, of the value of joy, of pure energy, of pure human potentiality. We're human beings, and we respond with our affections. We respond with the heart. As Dietrich von Hildebrand notes, to be moved by some sublime beauty in nature and art, or by some moral virtue, such as humility or charity, is allow ourselves to be penetrated by the inner light of these values and to open ourselves to their message from above. It is a surrender which implies reverence, humility, and tenderness. It is a reverence which requires reverence, humility, and tenderness, something radically different than the kind of sexual consumerism that Abigail talked about. It involves the gift of yourself. It involves an act of worship, a gift of your body. Last week, this is an image from St. Thomas Aquinas at Purdue. I was at Purdue, and they're here. And the students who were hosting me, I was talking to them on this topic, and they said, do you want to go? They were giving me a view of the church, and then they left me at the sort of the Eucharistic Adoration Chapel. And they said, well, we'll come and get you for your talk, which was in 45 minutes. And I was like, I love the Lord, and I should adore the Lord that long, but I might do something else during this time, so I'll come see you, too, when I'm done. So I went into the church, and I encountered this image, which is now my favorite image of Mary. And I describe this as what happens when one encounters a concrete image like this. Look at the way that Mary, her line, the kind of line of her form, looks at her infant child. This is the way my wife looks at our children. How does one not perceive in this gift of this image a value of the tenderness of divine love? And how do you not but respond with the fullness of your heart, with your affections, by kneeling and lighting a candle, which I did. And I didn't have any money, so I promised Purdue, I'll send you some money. Sorry. It's very hard. There's no cash, and so in my life anymore. So I owed these churches all this money from these candles I've lit. So I guess that's purgatory. So all right. So liturgy forms us in a proper use of our affective responses. It orders us to this because it ideally should use our affect. Too often in the post-conciliar era, we've had liturgies that don't actually move our affect, or they try to communicate too much. So many words. The quantity of speech is extraordinary. Yet, in persons formed by the liturgy, as Hildebrand writes, the person who's formed will rejoice and be filled with enthusiasm at the conversion of someone, the nobility of a holy friendship, the exalted character of truth, the beauty of nature at the greatness and depth of a work of art. He will affirm God's glory, and he will understand that he owes the value, the adequate response to which is objectively due to it, to give oneself over. This is how the liturgy functions. It moves our affect. So I'll give a Lenten example. This is my favorite antiphon for Lent set by Palestrina. It's Psalm 42. music makes possible in this particular instance, it is the concrete way we long for God. I've often talked to young people that will say things, this is sort of unrelated exactly, but the young people will say, well, I pray all the time. What do you mean when you pray all the time? Well, I think about God all the time. What does that mean? Like, do you never think about food or walking or is it raining? That unless we actually have a concrete form by which we learn to desire God, this is the desiring of God. It gives us a world of value where, as a deer longs for running streams, so my soul longs for you, my God. What does that mean? It sounds like that. It sounds like that. It's that material that forces you, that in some ways invites you, not forces you, but offers you to give your will, to give your body over. You see where we're moving. This always happens. And that movement of the affect, that movement to see the value and love of God, that actually opens us up to the way in which all our values are transformed. When joy arises in our soul, our free spiritual center has a decisive function to fulfill. So when this arises, it's not enough. This is where I think the consumer paradigm sometimes relies upon too much affection. The idea, for example, that Abigail was talking about, that when you have desire, then you must find a way to let it out. I'm interested in you, therefore I make out with you. When joy arises in our soul, we don't just act on it. We have a center that can make a decision about it, that can give ourselves away freely through it. Here we touch upon the deepest point of man's freedom, the ultimate yes or no which our center can utter. Our center can utter a yes or no, can give itself away through the movement of our affect. That's why to say I love you to someone is so damn scary. And that's no different in a hookup age or any age. I mean, there's some part of working with young people, to be frank, which is exactly the same as working with every people ever, because they're people. And it's never been especially easy to turn to someone whom you love and say, I love you, because you're afraid that they're going to say back, I don't love you. That's the great sort of mystery of love. The great mystery is that someone actually says, I love you back. There's freedom there, but freedom opens us to woundedness. It opens us to the possibility to be wounded. And that's why, and we're moving towards the end now, that's why actually the liturgy forms us best to actually transform this desire to give our bodies a way of love through a reformation of our imagination, but also a reformation of our wills. My students are surprisingly interested in the rite of marriage. Sure, sometimes they're interested in like annulment questions. They're very interested. What happens if, your cousins or, that kind of fun thing. I teach a lot of people from the South. No, I'm just kidding. Sorry, I'm a Southerner. Sorry, I can make that joke. I am alone capable. I am from East Tennessee. But what's so remarkable to them is the church's concrete teaching that what is most natural, what is most good, what is most beautiful is actually what gets taken up into divine life. O God, who to reveal the great design you formed in your love, willed that the love of spouses for each other should foreshadow the covenant you graciously made with your people, so that by fulfillment of the sacramental sign, the mystical marriage of Christ with his church might become manifest in the union of husband and wife among your faithful. Wait, my love manifests to the world the union of Christ and the church? My love, my strange sort of half-hearted, sometimes love is to become the kind of manifestation to the world of the total love of Christ to the church? Well, that makes my natural love a little more important. It makes me think what it means to love. It transfigures every moment of the nuptial life. That the act of worship now extends into the home, where the couple become, in marriage, this place of the transformation of all creation through the most boring things ever. As I say to my students, if you think marriage is about sex, you don't realize how important it is to have someone take out the garbage. If you think marriage is the culmination, it's about communion. It's about a transformation of natural love, of natural goods into something more. And it's Eucharistic. It's learned throughout your life as you keep going to Mass. This is why I tell my students to go to Mass, not because it's always the most exciting thing in the world. It isn't. I haven't attended a full Mass for 5 years. My children hate me. They don't believe in kneeling. I mean, there's this idea of children as sort of naturally religious creatures, which I subscribe to, but then sometimes I doubt it, like this Sunday, when my son decided to rebel against the existence of God. So I took him out 9 times. I was ready for him to participate in the scrutiny, actually. I wanted to sort of offer him. But this order of giving yourself means that we're ordered fundamentally to communion, that in the Eucharistic sacrifice, of course, it is the totality of the sacrificial love of the Word made flesh that's given, of the splendor of the Father. But it's also the love of the church offered back in return, as Dr. Klein said the other day in her own presentation. Look, O Lord, upon the sacrifice which you yourself provided for the church, and grant in your loving kindness to all who partake of this one bread and one chalice, that gathered into one body by the Spirit, they may truly become a living sacrifice in Christ to the praise of your glory. That we, offering our bodies, might become a living sacrifice to God. Make of your bodies a living sacrifice, holy and obedient. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your minds. That's Paul. This is true for everyone. This is, in fact, I think, the dimension of the Second Vatican Council that most needs to be unlocked for the renewal of the world. That actually what we're not trying to do is to get when Pope Francis, I suspect, says we don't want people to just get to the church, well, that doesn't mean that then we just want to forget the church and go to the world. Rather, it's the world that has to be transformed and configured in all of its dimension and Eucharistic likeness in love. And this happens in a totally normal way. It's really, really practical. Family life is the first order of formation, the first culture of formation, because it's the space where love is just kind of picked up, ideally, not always. Broken homes exist. That's why the church has to care most for broken homes. To care for young people is to care for those broken homes. I come from one. Pastoral care is needed. But in my own home, which ideally is not exceedingly broken, now, the natural gift of love, of solidarity, of communion that's learned is so natural. When both our children are adopted, our son, Tommy, is 5, and our daughter is almost a year. We found out she was going to enter our life 2 hours after she was born. And so we left. I left work. Sorry, John. I left work, and we went to pick up our daughter on Saturday. And we hadn't told our son yet, because we didn't know we really didn't know what was happening. So we didn't want to say you have a sister or not. So we waited, and we brought, I went home that night, I took him home, and I said, Tommy, you're going to go meet your sister tomorrow, which is the first time in his life he considered what that would mean. But because he's used to me just telling him things, he said, okay. So we left that morning and went, and he held his sister, and I watched him for the first time knew what it meant to care for the weak. Not abstractly. I didn't have to say, Tommy, go to the periphery and care for those who are on the margins. The periphery was there, It's his, as he calls her, my Maggie. My Maggie. It's really beautiful. I've never been emotional about it, but now that I say it. And now he cares for her and watches for her. And the depth of love towards weakness. Now, eventually, he's going to probably sort of lock her in a closet or something like that. But that's later. The family constitutes a communion of love and solidarity, which is uniquely suited to teach and transmit cultural, ethical, social, spiritual, and religious values essential for the development and well-being of its own members in society. By exercising its mission to educate, the family contributes to the common good and constitutes the first school of social virtue, which all the societies need. His motto is not sum, but sursum. Not cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, that I am. But lift up your hearts. Lift up your hearts. And the image that the church has always used for this kind of Eucharistic love at her center is of the pelican feeding her young. The pelican feeding her young. The pelican whose love is so hospitable that opens up for love. And in marriage, in our formation into the sort of sexual desire and sort of family life and marriage of young people, there's nothing more essential than giving them an image of this love through apprenticeship, through the hospitality of love. And I'll conclude here by just speaking of Bill and Peg LaRoche, parishioners at Our Lady Help of Christians in Newton, Massachusetts. My wife moved there when we were very young. We had been married for less than 6 months. We had no idea what we were doing. I hated my graduate program almost the first day. My wife hated her job because she moved from the Midwest, where there were infinite volunteers, to Boston, where everybody was at the Cape. Every single human being was at the Cape. There was no way to get a volunteer for a catechist. There were so many tears. She was crying all the time. I learned to just sit there because I realized you're not supposed to do something all the time when there's tears. You sometimes just be there. It's probably been the most important thing to me as a teacher. When my students come to cry, I just sit there. But I'm very comfortable with it now. And Bill and Peg, we were lonely. We were all by ourselves in a city we had never lived in. And Bill and Peg, they didn't think about themselves as especially remarkable people. They were. Peg, God rest her soul, was divorced. Her husband left her. Had 2 kids. When Bill came along, who was a firefighter, and said, I'm going to marry you, and we're going to raise your kids and have our own kids together. So they got married. Bill built the pews in the parish. Bill would go on the youth group mission trip, which I hated going on. There were uncomfortable floors, but Bill was there. Bill and Carmine and this series of old men drinking Dunkin' Donuts all the time, or coffee, but being there. And they opened our home to us. At Thanksgiving, everyone came over. And it wasn't like come over at 6, it was more just come over. That's hospitality. Real hospitality is our door is literally always open. We don't care. At Christmas, at every moment, they were there. This is the kind of love this is where I learned that marriage was about more than sex. I think I implicitly knew it, but I learned it because I watched in the nuptial union of Bill and Peg what divine hospitality looked like. And it was probably more formative in the early years of my young adult marriage than any theological class I took, than anything that I did at Notre Dame, than anything else. It was Bill and Peg who taught me what Eucharistic love looked like, what the life of the pelican looked like. This is the kind of thing we need to give to our young people in concrete ways, this form of apprenticeship, this form of a renewal of your imagination where we can come to determine how the value of love is renewed through the supernatural values offered by the sacraments. We'll probably need to use better words than that, but this is an educated audience, so I hope you don't mind. And we need to show them that this form of life is possible. So much of the controversy around Amoris Laetitia has reduced it to ethics and social sort of sociology. This is a painful thing for those of us who love marriage. This document has to be about the formation of communion into love. And it's going to be integral to the work after the synod, I expect, since so many of us young people happen to find ourselves falling in love. Thanks.